Thank you, I appreciate it. I do feel I owe you an explanation. When I was running for governor as a libertarian, I did discover that generally the only way I could get applause was to lead them myself. So that explains that outburst. Let me start by saying one of the reasons that it's difficult to disentangle the different things that we see is that there's two interlocking phenomena. The first is the middleman economy. For the first time in human history, it is possible simply to sell reductions in transactions cost. Until now, it has often been useful for people who sell products to find ways of reducing transactions cost. But it has been in service of selling a product. The product now is the reduction in transactions cost itself. And the second is the sharing economy, where what's being sold is access to excess capacity. And the reason that that's important is that we have a whole lot of stuff that we don't use enough. Let me give an example. I'm a sad old man. I have a BMW 330, it's black. I'm just the asshat you think I am. Swerving in and out of traffic, blinking my lights, very proud of my car. When I approach my house, the door magically rises because I have a garage door opener. I pull in there and my car is stored for much of its life in that really expensive piece of real estate that is safer and cleaner than about 50% of the world's population actually live. Now, for much of the rest of the time, my car, because I was an administrator at Duke for 10 years, I have the parking spot of God. Which means that I park in a really high-valued space. But more important, even when I'm not there, there's still an empty spot for me to put that car. So I'm paying for my car several times. I paid for the car, I paid to store it at home, and I pay to store it at Duke. And when it's not at Duke, it's at home, and when it's not at home, it's at Duke, or it's neither of those places because it's on the road. I think that 50 years from now, people are going to look back and find it remarkable that we spent so much time and effort to ensure that the stuff that we had but were not using could not be used by anyone else. I drive my car about 30 minutes a day, 4 or 5 days a week. All of the rest of the time, it is sitting in one of those two spots. Why? Why would we do that? Well, because not all of this audience has a complete introduction to economics. I wanted to introduce a couple of concepts. First is voluntary exchange, and a word that I have tried to introduce, voluntary exchange, meaning truly voluntary exchange. The reason that voluntary exchange is important is that if you and I engage in a voluntary exchange, we're sure that both of us are better off. One of us may be only indifferent and the other better off, but generally both of us are better off. The public policy implication is the more voluntary exchanges take place, the greater the improvement to public welfare. Now, which exchanges should take place? That may be difficult to say, but the more voluntary exchanges take place, the better. Transactions cost acts like friction in a physical system. Transaction costs prevent the movement of goods and services towards higher valued uses. We're prevented from discovering things. The interaction of these two means that transactions cost prevents many otherwise beneficial voluntary exchanges. Transactions cost prevents many otherwise beneficial voluntary exchanges. The third concept is a piece that I just wrote and did another podcast on Econ Talk about permissionless innovation. One of the advantages of a system that allows innovation without permission is that people are able to conduct, in effect, searches about new ways to facilitate mutually beneficial transactions. A lot of them don't work, but the ones that do make everyone better off. Requiring permission, whether it be from competitors or from regulators, may in some cases be justified, but it's going to reduce, acting as a kind of reduction in the vitality of the system because of imposing what in effect are transactions cost. Fourth are profits. Profits in some ways drive this system. Profits are the excess of revenues over cost, and I think all of you know that. But let's think of it differently. Suppose I'm going to make a new product. Should we as a society make this product or not? Well, suppose that I go around to some owners of inputs and I agree mutually beneficially, voluntarily, to pay them a certain amount for the input that they're willing to provide. After having paid for all of those inputs, having paid for my costs, I then go out into the market to try to sell this product. If I am able to sell it at a price that's higher than the cost of all of its inputs and putting those inputs together in this particular form, that's a signal that it's valuable to the society. What is the value to society of producing this product? Well, in a way, the answer is consumer surplus. Although profits drive the system, the goal is consumer sovereignty, which means that consumers decide subjectively which products will be built and which will not. Entrepreneurs try to discover which products consumers want and whether they can build them at a price that covers the costs of producing them. Many of you own an iPhone or some other smartphone. What's the most that you would pay for it? You probably couldn't do without it now. It's like heroin. So if a smartphone cost you $600, but you'd pay $2,000 for it, the value to you is $1,300. It's hard for us to quantify that, though, because that's just what consumers do when they decide to buy a product. They capture for themselves the implied consumer surplus. So you might think of profits as a reward for entrepreneurs seeking out new ways to produce consumer surplus. Well, with that introduction, let me give the 2x2 matrix. Now, notice I came in with my jacket on, so I fulfilled the terms of my contract. Political science, all essential truths are expressed in 2x2 tables. Advanced political science goes up to 3x3 tables. So this is an advanced political science lecture. So rows are levels of excess capacity. Columns are levels of transactions cost. Now, there are some things that have very high excess capacity that probably we can't imagine having such low transactions cost that they could be commodified. Because what this matrix is about is commodification. Is it possible to commodify the excess capacity which can then be bought and sold on the market? I am an assiduous brusher of teeth. Nothing creepy, only my own teeth. But still, every morning, every evening, I brush my teeth for at least 2 minutes. That means, though, that for at least 23 hours and 55 minutes per day, my toothbrush hangs there in its toothbrush holder. It is unlikely that we can take advantage of that excess capacity. Hard to imagine a way of selling the fact that my toothbrush is almost never used. However, it's fairly easy to imagine that if I have a car in a few minutes and you need a ride, we can find a way to commodify that, and it's called Uber, and many of you have experience with it. Somewhere in between those lies most of the profit opportunities in the new economy. So the best value proposition is where the valuable excess capacity is very high, as with a car or an apartment in Paris and New York, which I can then commodify using an app called Airbnb. The best value proposition is where transactions costs are high but reducible and excess capacity is high. There are many things where both are low, and those are consumables. That is, if I have an apple and I eat the apple's done. There's nothing more that I can do with that. We understand how to sell those things. There are a number of things that we already rent. When I have a rule. I travel pretty often on business. When I travel somewhere, I make it a point never to buy a car. I always rent one. Now, I can wait. I go to the Hertz counter, and they've already found a way to make it very easy to rent these things. The question is, why do we own anything? Why do we rent a lot more stuff? There's quite a bit that's already rented. Now, I do want to point out that it's quite possible that even with low excess capacity and high but reducible transactions cost, there are other activities that are part of the sharing economy but have nothing to do with excess capacity. Right now in Brooklyn, New York, there are bearded young men wearing checked flannel shirts and bearded young women who are making designer pickles, bourbon maple pickles for $17 for a small jar of pickles that are then delivered by Uber. Now, the reason that this is sustainable is that if I can make 1,000 or so of these a month and sell them for $17, I can make a living because someone can find them online and have them delivered without having to take the train or an Uber over to Brooklyn, pick up the pickles, and then go back. The delivery costs of this actually hark back to something that I'm 59, so I'm pretty old. I remember when milk, cheese, bread, other things were delivered to our house. And when you think about it, it's pretty amazing that we have so few things delivered to our house, although it's happening again because of Amazon. But we go to the garage, we get into a car, we drive, we park in an enormous impermeable area that takes up a lot of expensive real estate. We walk into a store, push a cart around, put stuff in it, and then go to a counter where someone takes all the stuff out of that cart, one at a time, and checks the price. They then put it into a bag where we put it back into the cart for the third time, take it to our car, unload the cart for the fourth time, take it to our house, and then unload it into our house. That's a lot of transactions cost if there was some way of acquiring that in a way that was easier. So I want to tell a story of three men. First was one of my dissertation advisors, Douglas North. Doug won the Nobel Prize in economics in 1993. I graduated in 1984, so I had absolutely nothing to do with that, but I still try to claim credit for it in a pathetic way. My dissertation defense is pretty scary. Your dissertation defense project, when you stand up, when you're a graduate student and you have to defend your thesis, it's pretty frightening. Doug asked me a question, and being an economics graduate student, I approached the board and started writing equations. After 2 or 3 minutes, mercifully, Doug put his hand up and said in a voice that you might use to a well-loved but not very bright child, "Michael, the answer is transactions costs." And I realized that for Doug, it didn't matter what the question was. The answer is transactions costs. And 10 years later, I realized that he was right. Second man here was Ronald Coase, also a Nobel Prize winner, who famously in 1937 wrote a paper on the nature of the firm where he asked a question that I think economists probably should ask more often. In economics, we often talk about the power of markets and prices to direct resources towards higher valued uses. That is, we have a decentralized process where markets reflect the opportunity cost of resource and give signals to the owners of those resources how they should be used. Coase's question was, well, if markets are so great, why are there firms? Because firms, after all, intentionally subvert the actions of the price mechanism. If I'm working on a production line and I'm putting a bolt into the chassis of a Buick, I don't go on eBay and auction off the Buick chassis. It just goes on to the next person. There's no price that I charge to the next person. We are directed in that production line to take advantage of division of labor, but inside a nexus of contracts that requires that I act according to the instructions of my boss. So it's a small command economy. It intentionally suppresses the price mechanism. Why? What's the answer to Coase's question? I've already told you the answer to all questions is transactions cost. And they spoke as if with one voice, and they did say transactions cost. So the answer is transactions cost. The reason that there are firms, even though markets do under some circumstances do a pretty good job, is transactions cost. Now, if Coase were alive today, he might ask a different question. Why do we own so much stuff instead of renting?
Transactions cost.
And the answer is transactions cost. Often, what we want is not a power drill. What we want is 2 holes in the wall here. It's just that the easiest way to get 2 holes in the wall here is to own a power drill. But if it were cheaper to rent it or to pay someone else to do it, we would totally do that. We are agnostic, indifferent about the means by which we achieve our ends. But we're used to thinking in terms of ownership because until now the transactions costs have been so low. The third man, and forgive me if I call it a man, is the widget. The widget is an abstract good or service that economists use to stand in for any good or service. But look at it. It's hard metal. It has intricate gears that fit together. It has no apparent purpose. I know many men that are described that way. So the point of a widget is A owns it and will take any price greater than $1. B wants it and will pay any price less than $5. What might keep this from occurring? The answer is transactions cost. Even though B wants it and they'll pay a price less than 5, up to 5, and A will take any. So this is not garbage. A wants it. A doesn't want to throw it away. A values it at 1. But in some sense, B should own this. But they may have a hard time finding each other. They may have a hard time negotiating a price. They have a hard time making the payment. And they may not trust each other to deliver this and not beat each other up or steal the money. So let's suppose that transactions cost are $7. There would be no transaction. In fact, A and B have never met and they've never considered exchanging. This thing has not been commodified, even though it's in the wrong place. All over the world, stuff is in the wrong place. But it's never been commodified because we don't think in terms of this being a commodity that can be bought and sold. But suppose an entrepreneur, E, has a piece of software that reduces transactions cost from 7 down to 1. Well, then B would pay $4 and he would have paid 5, so he gains $1. A receives $2, would have taken 1, he gains $1. E receives $1 for the licensing fee for the app, and since there's zero marginal cost on that, because this is permissionless innovation, he's able to write this and just sell it in the App Store, and other people can buy it without having securing permission or any kind of license. And transactions cost use up $1, like friction in physics. So in a physical system, friction is just burned off as heat. In an economic system, transactions cost is just used up without any return to anyone. But the world is a wealthier and more prosperous place, even with the same amount of widgets. Even with the same amount of widgets. There's no increase in the number of widgets, but the world is a better and more prosperous place. 3 people made money. Well, I want to define transactions cost, and to make it easier to remember, I wanted to give 3 TR words. The first is triangulation. We have to be able to find each other. We have to agree on terms, including price. The second is transfer. We have to be able to find a way to make the payment and deliver the good in a way that's immediate and as invisible as possible, and then trust. A way of outsourcing the assurance of honesty and performance of the terms of the contract. This last one, in some ways, is the most difficult, but also the most interesting. If I go to a strange city and I want to know what restaurant to go to for dinner, I probably still ask the concierge. If you're under 40, what do? Yelp. You look at Yelp. Why? Transactions cost. It's such an easy thing to be able to look at Yelp. There's a bunch of people who don't know each other who have independently registered their views. The concierge is probably going to send me to his cousin's restaurant. But Yelp, they have no reason not to report honestly, so what do you look at in Yelp? You look for 2 pieces of information. One is the mean score, and then you also look at the worst reviews. Because the best reviews are probably written by the guy's cousin. There is still the same problem. So somebody can load it up with good reviews, but if there are some bad reviews, you look at those. You don't know those people. How can you trust them? Well, it's because we have found through the use of aggregating statistically independent judgments, a way of outsourcing trust that's extremely cheap, but that provides assurance in a way that we used to have to rely on reputation or brand name we'd have trouble with if we weren't in the city and weren't aware of the reputation or brand name. So I have two sons. The older one is 27. He lives in the Lower East Side of New York. He's a graduate student at NYU. And he's a stone hipster. He always burns his mouth on soup because he has to eat it before it's cool. It's a hipster joke, before it's cool. No, I can totally wait. I'm in no hurry. So both of them have moved. It's like a little joke grenade. It goes off. Oh! Both my sons, the younger son is 25. He's now a real estate manager here in Durham. Both of them have moved several times. I have the most amazing storage unit. So it's full of a bunch of stuff that they said, you know, I might use this someday. And of course, I have nostalgia for it, so they might. So the broken couch that was in their apartment in college, they might use that. Furthermore, I have an outboard motor. I do not have a boat. But I have an outboard motor that's probably worth at least $3,000. I have been paying $147 per month for this storage unit for 4 years. If you multiply that out, I should have set the damn thing on fire. Why didn't I? The answer is transactions cost. It's straightforwardly transactions cost. I think this should be worth something to someone. Now, I should have given it away, clearly. But each month, $3,000, I know it's worth $147. I'm going to pay the $147. It's full of a bunch of stuff that would be worth more to someone else, and I have now spent more than its value preventing anyone else from using it. There's no reason for that to be true. Excess capacity is variable with respect to the transactions cost of reassigning the use of the durable good. So the theorem here is that excess capacity is variable with respect to the transactions cost of reassigning the use of the durable good. When I look at my closet or garage, I don't see excess capacity, I see the storage of valuable items. But those suits, shirts, my car, my lawnmower, people have lawnmowers. Why? So in a suburban neighborhood, you go down the street, every one of these houses has their own crappy lawnmower that's hard to start. It gets used 45 minutes once a week, or if you're that neighbor, once every 2 weeks. There's no reason not to share these things, except that sharing them is difficult. You can't rely on other people to take care of it. The only reason that we don't have one excellent lawnmower every 5 houses is transactions costs. Lowering transactions cost raises the opportunity cost of idle, durable goods. But that doesn't translate into excess capacity unless we have a way of selling those reductions in transactions cost. The point is, though, and this is interesting, there's actually no set capacity. It's not a technical consideration. We tend to think of excess capacity or unused resources as a technical matter. It's really a question of transactions cost. Can I commodify this or not? If I can commodify it, then it's excess capacity. Otherwise, it's something I'm storing. I'll pay to store it. It doesn't cost me to store it unless I have a way of selling it. This is from the cartoon Zits. Here you go, Mom. Thanks, Jeremy. What's all this junk? Well, it's stuff we're saving for you. These boxes are your elementary school papers and art projects. The trunk where I store your middle school memorabilia. You're going to want this old furniture, plus Grandma's china and knickknacks. My first apartment's going to be a backpack I carry around the world between gigs. Our attic has been living a lie. I think that the attachment to things, I guess I'm going to come out as a Rousseauvian in this instance. Our notions of status are socially constructed. And the fact that I have an unreasonably big house with a lot of storage and a stupidly expensive car that I barely use. Old people like that. If you look at my webpage, yes, I've got pictures of stuff. My sons have pictures of hang gliding in Nepal. They construct social status in a different way. And part of the reason is that it has become more expensive to own stuff. Not because the price has gone up, but because the opportunity cost has gone up. You commodify this when the opportunity cost is raised in the sense that I could rent it out. So if I have an apartment in Paris, we were just in Paris for 2 weeks in August, stayed in this amazing Airbnb. 2 bedrooms, had a huge deck overlooking, on the 10th floor, overlooking the Eiffel Tower. $200 a night, because it's August. There's no one in Paris in August. You can get, there's no Parisians at least. There's a bunch of rednecks like me, but there's no Parisians. Normally, what they would want is a really good lock to keep people out of that apartment. But because of Airbnb, that's too expensive. You can sell that excess capacity. Much of the building had Americans in it, which I admit is horrible. I'm sorry about that. But still, gosh, that was great. And the Parisian who was on vacation was making $200 a night. Could they trust me? Well, I have reviews on Airbnb, which I use often, and he insisted on a $3,000 deposit. $3,000 deposit partly selects for people who are more likely to be careful, but it also indemnifies the owner against damage. $3,000 of damage is quite a lot. The downside. I don't know if you know of Mark Andreessen. This picture is not retouched. He's an actual human cone head. In November 2011, he wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal, Software is Eating the World. So, let me ask you this. Seattle now has a minimum wage of $15 per hour. The idea was to provide a living wage. Suppose you go into a McDonald's in Seattle. What do you not see? People. Because think about what happens when you used to go into McDonald's. You go in, you stand there, and there's a board, and it has words on it. You say some of those words, but not others, to the person. I want Big Mac, fries, drink. They find the keys that have those words on them on their cash register, and they punch them. Turn the damn thing around. Just turn it around. Because I can punch those keys, and then I don't need to look up here. I can just look down there. That's the menu. It's on the cash register. Now, admittedly, there's no cash drawer, but no one under 40 carries cash anyway. So you just use your credit card. That person lost their job. There's no one working on the front line. They're all kiosks. Now, there may be perfectly good reasons to say, I want people to have $15 an hour when they work. But it dramatically accelerates the rate at which software eats the world because it raises the opportunity cost of having human workers. Instead, we can automate this because software eats the world. I recently flew into Toledo, Ohio, and I'm not going to go into why. It's none of your damn business. But I was in Toledo, Ohio, and I just want to admit that. My flight was delayed because I was on Delta. Delays every last time, always. So I was about 2 hours late, and we were clearly the last flight in, and my bag was the last bag off. And I got my bag, and I started to walk, and there's a guy literally standing by the door waiting to turn out the lights in the airport. So it's midnight, and they're closing. They're turning out the lights in the airport. And I think, how am I going to get my rental car? My phone buzzes, because the Hertz counter is dark. My phone buzzes, and I get a 5-digit code and directions to a place where I'll go outside. I punch in the 5-digit code. One of many little boxes open. There's keys in it, and the key is attached to a little marker that says A3. I walk to A3. There's a car. I put the key in it. I leave. 3 people lost their job. 3 people used to work at Hertz at Toledo. Person at the counter, a person back that gave out the tickets, and then a person at the gate to check IDs on the way out. Software has eaten all 3 of those jobs. Software eats the world because it's very expensive to have human workers. And we saw this during the Industrial Revolution. So if you remember nothing else about my talk today, please remember this. Software is to service jobs. as robots and automation are to production jobs. Software is to service jobs, as robots and automation are to production jobs. So when we think of the fact that we have lost so many manufacturing jobs, mostly to increases in productivity, the same thing is going to happen, and maybe faster, when it comes to software. Now, for much of my life, I have heard the story, well, yes, we're losing production jobs, but there's going to be an expansion in service jobs. Well, maybe, but those service jobs will probably be white collar. And even some of those, accounting, medicine, things that can be taken over by expert systems, are likely to be replaced by software. Human beings are too expensive, not because we don't want them to have jobs, but because commodifying those things mean that we can do it in a different way that's more cheap. So the reason we own things is we actually want the stream of services that come from the item. So when I say I rent a car, you're not surprised. But I have a laptop. Why do I have a laptop computer? I have a desktop computer in my office. I have a desktop computer at my house. Once every 2 or 3 weeks when I travel, I pick up my laptop from the place that I have stored it unused for 3 weeks, and I take it on the trip, and I come back and I leave it there for another 3 weeks. Why not on the way to pick up my car at Hertz, don't I go buy the little Laptopia machine, run my credit card through, and my laptop comes down. I can use it for 2 days. All of my files and software are stored in the cloud. All I need is a simple interface with a keyboard and a screen, or maybe the ability to recognize my voice and the ability to project an image on a wall. It doesn't have to be a keyboard and a screen. It could be a completely different, dumb little machine that's just a way of inputting data and receiving data. Because all of my data and software live in the cloud. I could use this once every 2 or 3 weeks for a day or two, and it would be used every single day by 2 or 3 people. Instead of me holding that laptop, which is pretty expensive and loses value pretty fast. After 3 years, I need a new laptop. Well, I've probably used it 30 or 40 times. That's not very much. Let me ask, do you hitchhike, ma'am?
No.
You don't hitchhike? Why not? Why don't you hitchhike?
It's dangerous.
Transactions costs. How quickly they forget. No, I mean, sometimes the answer I get is, oh, it's creepy. It's dangerous. Well, is it? If I give a version of this talk in Central Europe, as I often do, so if I'm in Croatia, Romania, Czech Republic, Poland, I say, how many of y'all in the last week used BlaBlaCar? Half. How many have used BlaBlaCar? How many of you have used BlaBlaCar? How did it work?
Worked really well, actually. Cheaper. It's trustworthy.
Isn't it just like Uber? No, it is not. BlaBlaCar is hitchhiking. Think, if you go out on 147 and you watch all the cars go by and trucks, there's one person in all those damn things. Well, that's local though. What about if you looked at I-40 and they're going to somewhere out west? So if you're in the Czech Republic, you're in Brno, and you want to go to Prague the next morning. It's 100 euros, well, they use crowns, but it's the equivalent of 100 euros for a train. It's pretty expensive. It's 10 euros to take BlaBlaCar. BlaBlaCar is an app that provides 4 pieces of information. 1, where are you? 2, where do you want to go? 3, what time? 4, how much do you want to talk? Blah means I actually don't like other people very much. So this is the one the economists choose. 2 is enjoys a natter, according to the software. 3 is rarely pauses speaking even for breath. So you can find someone who is going from where you are to where you want to go at the time you want to go, reserve that at a price that's far lower than a bus or train, in a truck or car that's going anyway. So if I take an Uber, that driver would not be going to my destination anyway. It's not a pure saving. This is a pure saving. That truck is going from Brno to Prague anyway. They just sell the empty seat. They're commodifying the excess capacity. So in a way, BlaBlaCar may be the purest example of what I'm talking about. Most Duke students don't live in North Carolina. If they have a bicycle, when they go home for the summer, they have to pay to store it. And if you can find a place to store it, it's probably going to cost $20 a month to store it. At what price would you be willing to rent your bike instead? Well, suppose you could rent your bike for just $2 a month and solve the 3 transactions cost problems, including trust. That is, if it's damaged, you're indemnified, you're insured against loss. Well, if you can rent your bike for $2 a month instead of storing it for $20 a month, you're in effect making $66 because you're saving the 3 months of storage cost and you're getting the $6 of revenue. And then your bike is still there in the fall just like it would have been. It's just that instead of paying to keep it behind a lock, someone else is using the bike. Bikes don't wear out very much. It's unlikely they're going to take it to San Francisco and back. Well, you can do that on Spinlister. And Spinlister, you can also rent surfboards, skis, luggage, a lot of things that are big and expensive, take up a lot of space that we don't use very often. And even if you do have it and you're storing it, that means you can rent it out and maybe be able to afford a pair of skis or a surfboard that's better than the one you would normally have been able to afford. Outdoorsy is Airbnb, but for recreational vehicles. I don't know if anyone's ever used that. I'm not going to ask if anyone's ever used Ashley Madison. I was giving a talk in Ottawa, and there was, I'm sure this was just a coincidence, but it happened, there was a member of parliament there, and when I put this slide up, he ran out. I think his phone had buzzed, but he may have wanted to check his account. I'm not sure. Ashley Madison sells reductions in the transactions cost of meeting other married people who want to have an affair. So the economic revolutions don't really care about our morality. What they care about is the logic of profit, like I talked about at the beginning. So it might be that the expectation that I will be caught having an affair will keep me from having an affair. But it's much more likely that I can do it furtively and successfully if we're able to sell reductions in transactions costs. So it's the profit logic of this, not any kind of ethical logic. Most of you have probably used Uber. And Uber, in a way, is another pretty pure example, though not as pure as BlaBlaCar. If I have a car in a few minutes and you want to ride, we can negotiate a mutually beneficial transaction. Now, if I were to pull up in my BMW, I see a young woman walking down the road, and I pull up and roll down the window and say, "Hey, you want to ride?" Like the police get called and it's a thing, and don't ask me how I know. I wouldn't even do that. It's just creepy. It's just straight up creepy. I wouldn't do that. And I wouldn't expect someone to pull up and ask me if I wanted a ride if I was walking, or knock on their window or ask if I can have a ride. But yet, there really are mutually beneficial transactions that could easily be negotiated. That's really all that Uber does. Uber sells reductions in transactions costs. They do not provide taxi services. They find a person who wants a ride, and they find a person who has a car in a few minutes. Now, one of the interesting things about economics is that sometimes you can make predictions. I used to think that I had ideas and that I was a genius entrepreneur. Turned out that any idea that I had, 3 people had 2 years ago, and one of them actually is already making profits on it. So far from being a genius entrepreneur, what I can do is make Darwinian predictions. And the Darwinian prediction might take this form. Who knows the story of the Star of Bethlehem orchid? So famously, Star of Bethlehem orchid has 10 or 11-inch ribs down from the flower, and at the bottom is a tiny speck of extremely sweet nectar. Now, nectar is expensive for the plant to produce. So why would it do this and then put it in a place so inaccessible? Well, Darwin, when he saw this, said in 1862, this is a little bit hard to read, so the paper is on the various contrivances by which orchids are fertilized by insects and the good effects of intercrossing. So the pollen that the plant wants the moth to distribute is not going to be released unless the moth can extend its tongue all the way down 10 inches. But most moths don't have 10-inch tongues. Well, that's good because this orchid wants to make sure that moths only go to another orchid of the same kind. It's very important that it only goes to another orchid of the same kind. So there's a joint interdependence. There's a specialization where the orchid depends on the moth and the moth depends on the orchid. Now, the cool thing about this is that Darwin had never seen a moth like this. He just speculated it has to exist. It must exist because otherwise it would make no sense for the flower to look like this. It's too expensive. Well, there's the moth. It was discovered in 1903. And from its name, you can see they valued the fact that it was Darwin's prediction. So can we do something like that in economics? And the answer is yes. And here's my Darwinian prediction. I was giving a talk, and it suddenly occurred to me, because that morning I had taken an Uber to the Parliament House. And it occurred to me that when I pulled out my phone and looked at Uber, there was a surge. But Uber was only 3 minutes away. So I looked at Lyft, and Lyft didn't have a surge. It was $10 Australian cheaper, but it was 20 minutes away. So I had to go back and forth between these two pieces of software to decide this. Let me ask, what does Orbitz sell? What does Orbitz sell? Orbitz sells reductions in transactions cost in reductions in transactions cost. It is a meta seller of transactions cost. Because for me to fly on an airline, I want to find out what their routes are and what their prices are. So I can go to the Delta site and find that out. But Orbitz realized it will be cheaper to say what all the airlines have for prices and routes. There should be something like this. There's a 10-inch moth, 10-inch tongued moth out there that's like Orbitz, but for ride shares. And of course there is. Go A to B. And so I asked, I didn't know, but I said, all right, you have smartphones, look this up. We found that morning that there's Go A to B and Fair Estimate. There's actually 3 or 4 more now. So are you in a hurry? You'll take the more expensive one, the car is closer. If you're not in a hurry, you'll take the one that's farther away that's cheaper. So the middleman revolution, in summary, what's being sold is the reduction in transactions cost. Not products or service, but the use of a product or access to a service that already exists. So I have 2 short cautions and then a story, and we'll be done. The 2 short cautions are, I have 35 acres of forest land south of Pittsboro, North Carolina. It is a tree farm. I employ a forester that helps us manage it sustainably. So the trees now, they're about 17 years old. Once they're 25, we can start taking some of the largest one and selling them for saw timber. In the meantime, we've done some clearing of the ones that had been killed by insects to make fire less likely and to sell some of those so that they don't compete with the larger trees and they'll grow faster. So we're trying to do this in a way that's pretty careful. I get down there, let's say, and I hear, bum, 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 bum. That's supposed to be a chainsaw. I once had an elderly gentleman in the front row who was sound asleep, and he threw his toupee 2 rows back. So that's what I aspire to. This was very disappointing. A couple of you were asleep, but there were no toupee throws. I hear chainsaws, and I walk back into the forest, and I see 3 guys with chainsaws and 2 forklifts. And I say, hey y'all, or something like that. What are y'all doing? And one of them says, oh, you're probably the owner. You don't understand markets. Markets are driven by consumer sovereignty. And if we don't have to pay taxes or the costs of property or obey regulations, we can provide wood products to consumers at much lower prices. I say, just a minute, 911. And men with guns come pretty quickly. And it's not my son's, it's the sheriff. Because I have a piece of paper. A piece of paper is a title, and it guarantees two things. In writing, the state signed it. First, I get the use of this land. Second, you do not get the use of this land without my permission. You certainly can't take my damn trees. Even psycho-libertarians like me think property rights are an important, the defense of property rights are an important function of the state. Which raises the question why it is that psycho-libertarians like me generally approve so, I think, thoughtlessly of Uber. Suppose you were on the island of Manhattan and you see a yellow taxi. There, riveted to the front of the taxi, is a round disc of metal. It is a medallion. Medallions have sold for as much as $700,000. That is, someone pays the state $700,000, they get a medallion. The state then uses the money for the things that states do. Suppose I drive an Uber on Manhattan. The taxi driver comes up to me and says, "What are y'all doing?" And I say, "Oh, you're probably a medallion owner. You don't understand markets. Because if I don't have to pay taxes, I don't have to get a license, I don't have to pay insurance, I can provide taxi rides at a much lower price." So the taxi driver says, "Just a minute, 911. And the police go, why? Why is it so obvious that those things are completely different? Wasn't a promise made in both cases that we have some obligation to keep? Now, we can talk if you want in questions about the differences, but it's not obvious to me that there's this strong defense in one case and an absolute rejection in the other. It seems to me that there's a continuum. About 18 months ago, the limitation on Uber was eliminated, and it is now possible from the Raleigh airport to take that. But for years before that, when I took an Uber to the airport, I would get out and hug the guy. Say hi to mom and them, because it was a $500 ticket. So it was a little creepy, but you had to try to protect them. You know, they were agreeing to you sit in the front and get out, get your luggage, say hi to mom and them. Still, I think there's a problem, as I said. So I'm making 2 points, and they're a little bit mutually inconsistent. One is, maybe the taxi drivers have a point. Maybe the regulation is justified. That doesn't mean that they can protect themselves, but maybe the regulation is fully justified in the sense that we're not taking full account of some of the promises that have been made. Well, the last story. How many of you all have a power drill? Or at home, your parents? Why? Transactions costs. Because as I said before, what you want is 2 holes in this wall right here. Well, suppose that my wife wants me to hang a picture and I need a drill. So I pull out my phone, I fire up Uber, I scroll down to Power Tools, I scroll down to Drills, I punch rent and just drop the phone because I'm done. 3 or 4 minutes later, an Uber driver, I don't know where and I don't care where, picks up a high-quality commercial power drill of the sort that I would like to rent. Because just like with Hertz, I have put my preferences into the software in advance and my payment mechanism, the way that I'm going to pay. They pick it up. The software solves the traveling salesman problem. The Uber has many deliveries to make, but it is done optimally just by saying, go here, go here, go here. The driver doesn't need to think about anything, which is just as well because there is no driver. It's a driverless car. It's just delivering stuff that I've rented. Uber is not a taxi company. Uber is a delivery company. Right now, it happens that it mostly delivers human butts. But there's nothing that says that's what it needs to deliver. After about 7 or 8 minutes, my phone buzzes, and the smart pod in the front of my house, when I go out there and put my phone near it, it unlocks and I take out my power drill. I drill 2 holes in the wall, and my wife says, "No, not that wall." Damn it. You think I'm making this up. I go over here, I drill 2 holes in the wall. We put up the painting. I return the drill to the pod, and the pod is smart. The pod communicates the fact that my rental has been returned. It cost me $2. I don't have to go pick it up. I don't have to deliver it. And now, when the driver picks up that drill, it's quite likely that that driver is going to take that drill to another rental. If we live in a pretty dense urban area, then that drill may be rented out 6 or 7 times a day. There are 110 million power drills in houses in the United States. Does anybody want to take a guess on the median lifetime use of the power drill? So we go from 110 down to 55. The 55 millionth most used power drill, 30 minutes. The total lifetime use of the 55th million. So there's a bunch of them that have never been used. They just put them away and lost them. Oh, that's a drill. I forgot about that. And they're not very good drills. So we have all of these drills that are pretty low quality. It has been estimated that we could get away with 6 or 8 million commercial quality power drills that were being rented out and used almost constantly. Now, admittedly, we use those up, but the number of people who need to have jobs manufacturing power drills will go from the number required to build 110 to the number required to build 6 or 8. Which means that in this and all sorts of other settings, where it's possible to rent rather than own, we will need far fewer. Which raises the question, what's going to happen to the job market? What's going to happen to citizens? I've actually described 2 trends. One is that because we can rent rather than own, we will not have to store stuff. We won't need parking garages or parking lanes in cities. We won't need closets. Many of the things that we now rely on that are expensive. If we want to build a new apartment block, you have to have a pretty expensive piece of real estate for parking. There's no reason for that to be true. If you take all of those things out, prices are going to plummet. On the other hand, we won't need to make very much stuff, so wages will plummet. Economists, unsurprisingly, summarize this with real wages. Real wages are the nominal wage, the amount that's on your paycheck divided by the price level. If prices fall by more than wages, those people are better off. The smaller amount that they make will go much farther. When you think about it, there's a bunch of stuff that we already have that's free. Twitter, Facebook, Wikipedia. There's so many things that at the margin are free. Once I have some sort of platform to look at it and internet connection. Almost all of those things are free. I can play video games, I can play first-person shooter games, basically for free. What's going to happen, though, to those people who don't have a job at all? It doesn't matter how low prices are if your wages are 0 or near it. So my question is, and the thing that I think we need to worry about, are these 2 things. First, how are you as individuals, you young people, going to manage your entry into a job market that is changing from long-term jobs with a salary and benefits to relatively short gigs where you can't rely on having a job for a long period of time? How will you develop your own abilities so that you can be your own brand name, so that people can find you on LinkedIn and say, I'm going to hire that person? So what we'll see is an explosion of division of labor and specialization. People have highly specialized skills, like the bearded young women making pickles in Brooklyn. You can make a living doing highly specialized things. Second, how are we as a society going to handle the problem that is in many ways similar to what led Marx to write the Communist Manifesto in 1848. The cities of Europe were on fire because the Industrial Revolution was destroying many of the cultural relations that until then we had depended on. Once things are commodified, you can no longer live as a subsistence farmer. You can't acquire food, you can't acquire goods and services. You have to have a money income to do that. People flooded to the cities in the 1830s and 1840s. The result was that many people couldn't find jobs. If they could, they lived in a tiny tenement. The cities of Europe were on fire. He thought the revolution was imminent. Might that happen again, where people who don't have jobs, don't have a source of income, don't have any sense of security or belonging to the society, will they once again make our cities be on fire? What are our obligations, either prudentially or ethically, to work on that problem? The last thing I want to say is to make sure you understand my basic point. What did Amazon start out selling? Books. What does Amazon sell now? Reductions in transactions cost. Amazon mostly makes money. More than half of Amazon's money comes from AWS, Amazon Web Services. Even proprietary web pages down at the bottom are powered by AWS. So what Amazon provides is a destination, a search engine, and a means of shipping and paying for the item. Very, very cheaply. They don't care what the item is, it doesn't matter. But Amazon is set up to deliver goods for ownership. 10 years from now, Uber is not going to be fighting the taxi companies. 10 years from now, Uber is going to be fighting Amazon. The big fight is Uber versus Amazon. Uber is set up for delivering rentals. Amazon is set up for delivering ownership products. The way that fight works out is what is really going to determine much of the direction of the economy in the future. Thanks for listening.